Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Naval War College Foundation's 9th Newport Lecture presentation of the 2021 to 2022 academic year, Military Professionalism Under Political Polarization. I'm George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our speaker series. I also wish to thank Chairman Bilden, our esteemed Board of Trustees, members, friends, and sponsors, as well as my hardworking staff for their continued support and commitment for the rewarding missions of U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. Enabled by our very generous foundation members, including many of you, the Naval War College has continued its innovative, cutting-edge education and research, scholarship, and wargaming programs that have sustained it as America's premier institution and standard bearer for professional military education. The Naval War College Foundation is proud to support the U.S. Naval War College and its mission to deliver excellence in education and research, and remains committed to providing the critical resources needed to advance its priorities of research and scholarship, curriculum and instruction, endowments and endowed chairs, capital improvements, faculty and student academic achievement awards, conferences and symposia, and regional studies. Tonight's presentation is an example of the scholarly work U.S. Naval War College students are immersed in during their 10-month academic year at the college, whose mission it is to educate and develop future military and civilian leaders of our nation and the world, including the following notable flag officers and distinguished civilian executives, including Admiral Scott Swift, United States Navy retired former commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Mike Rogers, USN retired commander, U.S. Cyber Command and director of the National Security Agency, General David Rodriguez, U.S. Army retired, former commander, U.S. Africa Command, Dr. Clifford Stanley, Major General, United States Marine Corps retired, Undersecretary of Defense, Personnel and Readiness, and Admiral Robert Papp, Jr., U.S. Coast Guard retired, former Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard. As a matter of protocol, should you have a question come to you during the presentation, please submit it via the Q&A box. I'll be happy to present it to our guest speaker during the Q&A session. We plan to address as many questions as time allows. Since the spring of 2020, we've been bringing Newport Lecture Series presentations and many other events hosted by the Foundation to you virtually. While we have begun to host in-person events again here locally in Newport and in such cities as Mobile, Alabama, and Redwood City, California, we plan to continue these lectures virtually for the foreseeable future. We do hope to see you again in person on the college campus or Naval Station Newport or other venue nationally when possible. Now, to introduce and welcome your distinguished guest speaker for tonight's presentation, Dr. Lindsey Conn is an associate professor in the National Security Affairs Department of the United States Naval War College. Her research focuses on military organizations, civil-military relations, militarized policing, and foreign policy public opinion. Her current projects include an investigation of the normative basis of military professional ethics, a historical analysis of the domestic use of federal military forces for policing in the United States, and several survey experiments examining how the U.S. public perceives various issues around the composition and uses of the U.S. military. Dr. Conn has testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee on the civil-military relations implications of Secretary Lloyd Austin's nomination as Secretary of Defense, before the Virginia General Assembly on issues of police and the National Guard reform, and before the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service on manpower issues. She has received the Civilian Meritorious Service Award from the Department of the Navy and the Commander's Award for Public Service from the Department of the Army. In 2013-2014, she worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict Office, managing and building partner capacity programs. She has been at the U.S. Naval War College since 2014, teaching courses on international security, foreign policy analysis, strategy and policy, and civil military relations. Dr. Conn earned a BA, an MA, and a PhD in political science, international relations, and political theory from Duke University. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Lindsey Conn.
George, thank you so much for that introduction. I apologize for the intrusion of my my research assistants here.
All guests are invited.
they leave me alone all day until I'm on Zoom. No, thank you so much to George and Shauna and Janine and everyone else who works on this series. I'm so glad to be here with you. I have planned this as a talk to generate questions and discussion rather than as a presentation of a problem with my solution to it. So please do feel free, as George mentioned, to put your questions in the chat even before we get to the Q&A section, and I hope we will have a lively discussion. So as George said, I am a political scientist and I've been at the War College for 7 or 8 years now, teaching international security, strategy, etc., and civil military relations. And one of the first questions I usually get is, what is this civil military relations thing? So civil military relations is sort of the field of study. It's broad, it's interdisciplinary, and it looks at questions having to do with how a society creates, maintains, governs, etc., a specialized fighting force in such a way that that force is both militarily effective, but also subordinate to the political system of that society. In other words, how to have a military that is effective against threats, but neither undermines nor preys upon its own society. Now, of course, these problems arise only in societies that have a specialized fighting force. So if you have a society where, for example, there's a pure militia system where everyone or every sort of person of fighting ability takes up arms when there's a threat, you don't really have these issues. But in most modern societies, there is a specialized fighting force, and so you confront these issues. So this field involves all kinds of questions, aside from just the question of civilian control of the military, which is the one that most people are familiar with from this area of study. Things like public opinion and recruiting and budgeting, but all of them relate back to this issue of how to maintain a healthy society when some group of people has been designated as being ready to kill and die for the interests of that society. So that's kind of the big picture of the context of what we're talking about, and it is the underpinning for why military professionalism matters. So as I said, the central dilemma of civil military relations is, how do you get a military that is both good at applying coercive, often lethal force, but resistant to applying that force to its own society in its own interests, right? In other words, how do you get a military that is effective against the threats the society wants it to fight, but doesn't use that power to prey upon or undermine its own society in its own corporate interests, for example? So there are lots of different ways to accomplish this, specifically to try to accomplish this idea of civilian control, this idea that the military only does what the society wants it to do. And I've got a list here on the slide. Now, most countries combine some of these methods. So I'll go through them. One is a sort of monitoring and punishment system, right? As it's familiar to everyone, the idea that if you break the rules, you will be caught because someone is watching. And if you are caught, you will in fact be punished. You can see these kinds of systems in lots of different manifestations. In the United States, of course, we have the Uniform Code of Military Justice, where if you break the rules, there is a justice system that investigates, tries, and then either convicts or acquits. You can also have, if many of you remember the idea of political officers from the Soviet army, for example, where there are people seated throughout the military whose allegiance is in a direct chain of command to a political overseer, not the operational chain of command, and whose sole job is to make sure that people are abiding by the rules and towing the proper line, right? So that's one form of control. Another is basic incentive, right? You pay people to do what you ask them to do, and if you pay them enough, they will do what you ask them to do. Now, this can look like it does in the United States, where we pay people in the military a decent living wage, or it can look like it does in some other countries, like, for example, Pakistan or China before 1998, when the military was actually given access to private business operations to make their own money. And then they were able to sort of compensate themselves, as it were. Another one is parallel security forces. And those of you who are familiar with the early documents of the United States under the Constitution will recognize this concept in the idea that a federal army would never be able to be a tool of tyranny because the states would all have their own militias. That's what we mean by a parallel security force. This manifests in other countries as, for example, you might remember Iraq having the Republican Guard, the Iranians having the Revolutionary Guard. These were parallel forces that had, in many cases, better equipment, better training, and were there as a check on the regular army deciding to turn on the government or the society. Then you have a method, well, multiple methods under the heading of what we might call identity. A militia is the purest form of this, right? A militia being identical with its society. The idea is that, and you see this in many of the Federalist Papers in the United States, the idea being that if the militia is identical with the people, then their interests will be identical and they will never turn on the people. But if you don't have a militia, if you have some specialized group of people that are professionals, then you can still use identity, and many countries do, in what we call ethnic stacking. It's not always ethnicity, but that's just a term that we use. And again, you can think of this in terms of Syria, where the Assad family, being Alawites, made sure that all of the military officers were also Alawites. In other words, that their identities were similar and therefore they had similar interests and the officers would not turn against the regime, right? This can be a class thing. For example, in the United Kingdom, for a long time, the military elite and the nobility were essentially the same group of people. And so the idea that the military elite would turn against their interests as the ruling or elite class of the country was just absurd. They had the same interests. That's what we mean by using identity. And then finally, you can indoctrinate or socialize, whatever word you want to use, your military with a professional ethic, with an ethic that says, I am the type of person who obeys the rules. I belong to an institution that has a particular space in society, and my space is to do this job and not to do these other things, right? In other words, it's to inculcate people with a belief that they ought to obey the rules. Okay, so this should give you an idea that there are lots of different ways to do this. Most countries use a combination. I can't think of any country that uses only one of these, right? So most countries use a combination. Some of these, as you can see, are sort of what we might call extrinsic motivation, right? Motivated from outside. Others are intrinsic. And what we know from a lot of sociological research and psychological research is that extrinsic motivations tend to be relatively weak, but can be strengthened by intrinsic motivations. And so if you want a really good system of control, you want to combine extrinsic and intrinsic. The really key takeaway here is that either identity or professional ethic needs to be there, or else you are going to have a situation where your military is only sort of questionably under your control, right? Okay, well, so I would point out that in a democratic republic, in any kind of democratic society, the idea of ethnic stacking is going to be difficult to do because it privileges one group of people above all of the others, and that's sort of antithetical to the way that a pluralistic democracy is supposed to work. So in a pluralistic democracy, you don't want to use the identity function. you want the military to be as broadly representative of society as possible to maintain its legitimacy. And so you are left with professionalism as your intrinsic option. So there is a classic model of professionalism, of the professional ethic, that most, I would say, modern industrialized or post-industrial states have adopted. And that is the Huntingtonian model. And it's up here on your screen. Most of you may be familiar with this model. You may not have heard it referred to as Huntingtonian, but it is absolutely the model that most American military professionals have internalized. And it goes like this. The policymakers are the experts at making policy. They decide what the state should do. The military officers are the experts at applying military means to achieve goals, right? They're the experts at that. And so the way this should work is that the politicians should decide what they want achieved. They communicate it to the military. The military thinks to themselves, how could we achieve this? They tell the policymakers, you have three options, right? High risk, medium risk, low risk. They pick the middle one, medium risk, and then they try to achieve that. And the idea here is that there are two clearly separate spheres of competency. And the best way, according to Huntington, to maintain this professional self-restraint is that neither of them interferes in the other's sphere of competence, right? The civilians tell the military what they want done, and then they back off. They say, you go do, I've told you what I want, go forth, right? And the military doesn't get involved in political issues like, why are we doing this? Or is this a good idea? They just, receive the direction. They say, yes, sir, can do. And they go forth and do, right? One of the implications of this, or one of the sort of fundamental tenets of this, is that military officers should never get involved in anything that is political, certainly never anything that is partisan, right? And so one of the implications of that is that they should obey all orders, regardless of whether of what the individual thinks about those orders and whether they are wise or good. Obviously not if they're illegal. That's the exception. But if the officer hears this order and thinks, oh, that's not going to work, that's not going to be good for American security, under this model, that is not that officer's decision. Just obey, right? One of Huntington's sort of famous formulations of this was that officers should be politically sterile. They have nothing to say about politics or political matters. Okay. So I would like to show you all, if I may, a quick clip from a wonderful program. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, called Yes Minister. Now this, where is it? Here we go. So see if you can spot the model of professionalism.
Lindsay, I'm not sure if you have the sound muted. We're not hearing the sound of the video clip from the video clip.
You're not hearing that sound? Okay. Let me see.
Maybe if you can.
Let's see. Here we go. All right, let's try this again.
I should think.
It looks good.
What's
there you go.
appalling no, about you can say you don't know. Oh, not you, Mr. No.
Well, who should lie?
that something is either morally right or isn't about morality.
Really? What is it about then?
Stability. Keeping things going. Preventing anarchy. Stopping society falling to bits. Still being here tomorrow.
What for?
Beg your pardon.
What is the ultimate purpose of government, if it isn't for doing good?
Minister, government isn't about good and evil. It's only about order or chaos.
And it's in order for Italian terrorists to get British bombs. And you don't care?
It's not my job to care. That's what politicians are for. My job is to carry out government policy.
Even if you think it's wrong?
Well, almost all government policy is wrong, but frightfully well carried out.
Humphrey, have you ever known a civil servant to resign on a matter of principle?
I should think not. What an appalling suggestion.
For the first time, I fully understand that you are purely committed to means and not to ends.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, Minister, and all of my colleagues, there is no difference between means and ends.
If you believe that, Humphrey, you will go to hell.
Minister, I had no idea you had a theological bent.
You are a moral vacuum, Humphrey.
If you say so, Minister.
It's time for your lunch appointment, Minister.
You're keeping very quiet, Bernard. What would you do about all this?
I would keep very quiet, Minister.
So, Minister, may we drop this matter of the arms sales?
No, we may not. I'm going to tell the Prime Minister, personally. Make an appointment for me, would you, Bernard? This is just the sort of thing that the Prime Minister wants to know about.
I assure you, Minister, this is just the sort of thing the Prime Minister desperately wants not to know about.
We shall see about that.
Indeed, we will. What's the matter, Bernard?
Oh, nothing really, Sir Humphrey.
You look unhappy.
Well, I was just wondering if the Minister was right, actually.
Very unlikely. What about?
About ends and means. I mean, will I end up as a moral vacuum, too?
Oh, I hope so, Bernard. If you work hard enough.
Makes me feel rather downcast. If it's our job to carry out government policies, shouldn't we believe in them?
What an extraordinary idea.
Why?
Bernard, I have served 11 governments in the past 30 years. If I'd lead in all their policies, I would have been passionately committed to keeping out of the common market and passionately committed to going into it. I would have been utterly convinced of the rightness of nationalizing steel and of denationalizing it and renationalizing it. In capital punishment, I'd have been a fervent retentionist and an ardent abolitionist. I would have been a Keynesian and a Friedmanite, a grammar school preserver and destroyer, a nationalization freak and a privatization maniac, but above all, I would have been a stark, staring, raving schizophrenic.
Okay, so note, by the way, that Sir Humphrey is articulating essentially the Huntingtonian ideal, but he does not actually stick to it ever. He subverts policies he doesn't like. He works to get policies implemented that he does like, but he is able to justify this to himself on the grounds that he is a technical expert and that the minister's only job is to make sort of broad policy decisions, which is precisely in line with the idea of the Huntingtonian professional ethic. Okay, so this is the ethic that most American military officers and honestly most officers in other NATO countries are imbued with when they are taught about how to be a professional. So it sounds like this should work, right? My argument tonight is that there are circumstances under which this really does not work, and that we need to sort of think about other options and whether any of them might be better. The answer might be no, maybe there aren't any better options, but we should at least think about it. So a couple of reasons why the political environment matters as to whether this sort of model of professionalism makes any sense. By the way, these aren't all the reasons the political environment matters. They are important reasons why it matters for the model of professionalism. So first of all, the idea of political sterility or neutrality is really possible only in an environment where some basic political principles have consensus support. The more your model of professionalism relies on some concept of politically sterile or neutral offices, the harder it is to maintain that under dissensus or polarization, right? So that's point number one. The more polarized the society is, the harder it is for anyone to remain neutral. The second one is that in any country, you have a sort of basic political philosophy, basic structures of decision-making, and these set parameters for what types of control are available and effective. As I mentioned before, in a democracy, for example, you don't want to use ethnic stacking as a form of control because it runs contrary to ideas of equality and participation, etc. The example that I have on the slide is that libertarian political cultures, those focused on the value of the liberty of the individual above that of the community, will have a more difficult time constraining political activity by military personnel than egalitarian or communitarian cultures. Why? Because in a libertarian culture, the individual's right is generally accorded more importance than the community's rights. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't limit political expression in libertarian cultures. We obviously do in the United States, which is a highly libertarian culture. But it does mean that it's harder to articulate to people why they should have to abide by those limitations. And we see that, I'll talk in a little bit about sort of some of the evidence for why the current political environment is problematic. And one of the things that we see is that a large majority of military personnel at this point in time no longer understand why they shouldn't criticize their political leadership, why they shouldn't make overtly political statements. It's just harder to justify that sort of thing to a libertarian society. That's just an example. And keep in mind, individualism is just one form of fragmentation. Another form is federalism, which is another characteristic of the United States. In any kind of fragmented society, the harder it will be to maintain a common professional ethic and a deep connection between the military and society, right? So the more fragmented society is, either vertically or horizontally, the harder it's going to be to maintain a military that has its own internal professional ethic and a connection between that group of sort of unified people and the very fragmented rest of society. So the trade-off there might end up being you have a very unified professional ethic within the military, but they are much more divided from society than you might want them to be. On the other hand, you might not be able to inculcate a professional ethic, but at least they have more in common with society. That's a trade-off. And then finally, up on the slide, this is a military effectiveness issue. As the more conflict starts to spread into different domains, the more you need an integration between strategic and operational reasoning and planning. The Huntingtonian concept of professionalism basically says that military officers have nothing to do with political strategy or with strategic planning. Those are political questions, the question of whether this is a good war to fight, whether this is the right war to fight for the interests of the United States, whether we should use military force in this theater or that theater. These are the kinds of questions that the Huntingtonian ethic says the military has nothing to do with. You just wait for the politicians to tell you, and then you salute and you go do it. That might work in a context where everyone agrees on what the threat is, where threat is a matter of consensus, and where everyone sort of agrees on the best way to deal with threat. But when you don't have consensus on those things, it becomes significantly more important that military leadership and policymakers can have nebulous, difficult, wishy-washy conversations about what they're trying to accomplish, what they want to accomplish, what they can accomplish, what they should try to accomplish, right? So this model of professionalism becomes problematic for a global superpower that is dealing with multi-domain threats and challenges. Okay, why does this matter right now? Polarization. And again, I'm not trying to claim that polarization is the only problem here, but I do think it's a big problem, and I just want to explain how and why. Number one, as partisan polarization increases, the sphere of consensus shrinks, which means almost everything becomes partisan. And if your professional ethic is, I can't do anything partisan, but everything is partisan, then you end up with only two options. You basically either violate your professional ethic and join a partisan side, or you step back from everything and you just become a pure technical tool, right? Both of these are suboptimal. So this can weaken the whole structure of sort of the military's position in society. What do I mean by polarization? Just to get everyone on the same page. This is the general public. And these are just two images and they don't tell you everything. The main takeaway from these images is basically, number one, polarization can be about people's ideologies shifting. And the US general public on average, if you drew the mean line here on these graphs, that mean has moved to the left over time. But as you can see, the distance between the median Democrat and the median Republican is much, much bigger now than it used to be. And the area of overlap is much smaller. There is, in fact, still a fair amount of overlap in beliefs. It's not the case that no one agrees on anything, but there's way less than there used to be. Where you see this in much more stark relief, however, is Congress. So the center has disappeared in Congress, which makes compromise extremely difficult and consensus almost impossible. And you will have seen the results of this. This is the result largely of what we call party sorting. So everyone has multiple identities that may be made salient at different times. You have your job, you have your position in your family, you have your religion, your regional origin, your political ideology, your gender, your race and ethnicity, your socioeconomic class, etc. These are all identities that everyone has. Several decades ago, it was not unusual for many of these identities to cross-cut party identity. That is, you might be a working class person and you might belong to either party. You might be conservative and belong to either party. You might be Jewish or Protestant and belong to either party. In short, if you told me, a social scientist, several demographic factors about yourself, I might still have a hard time predicting which political party you were in. That is basically no longer the case. While I'm speaking in generalizations, and there are always exceptions, basically people in the United States have sorted themselves into parties now in such a way that all of their identities align. And they have very little in common with people in the other party. This primarily happened in the 60s and 70s, stemming from the civil rights movement and Nixon's Southern strategy, if you're interested in that kind of thing. So one of the things that happens when this happens is what's called negative partisanship or negative affect. Because under these circumstances, when you have less in common with members of the other team, so to speak, it turns every issue into one where each team has to take a position, right? And you're either on my team or you're on the other team. Very few issues can remain outside of this sorting mechanism. Everything takes on, or almost everything takes on, some partisan flavor. So this is a context where it's almost impossible for anyone to remain neutral. Even if a person is very careful to avoid being viewed as endorsing one team or the other, and that's what we see most military leadership doing over the last several years, is being extremely careful to try not to be seen as endorsing one team or the other, with some exceptions, obviously, like those who appeared at Democratic and Republican national conventions. But even if you're being very careful, the teams themselves will try to co-opt you, especially if you're a military officer or a representative of the military, because it has such high confidence levels among the public. The public really likes the military. So if you're a policymaker on team A and you want the public to like your team or like your policy, you try and show them, hey, the military is with me, you like them, right? They're with me, so you should like me too, or you should like my policy. So even if you are doing your best to stay neutral, the teams are trying to co-opt you, and that's what the public sees. So this is a difficult context to stay neutral in, even if you are trying really hard. And it's also a difficult context to navigate when you're trying to manage your people, because the dynamics that are playing out in civilian society are also going to play out inside the military. The dynamics of difference and disagreement, etc. And where you might have 40 years ago might have been able to say, leave politics outside. Politics is now everything, right? And you can't leave it outside. So it becomes very difficult. So why does this matter right now? In particular, we have a lot of social science research. I brought props. We have a lot of social science research that, that indicates that both military personnel and the general public are becoming more accepting of violations of this professional norm. In other words, the norm no longer seems to be exercising much restraint, either on military people or on the expectations the public has for them. Second, as I just described, the teams, the public, are viewing the military increasingly through a partisan lens, which increases pressure on the institution, either to behave in partisan ways or to sort of not behave at all, which can be problematic for them. And the public might perceive things as partisan even when the military is desperately trying not to be. If you recall, after the Charlottesville rally several years ago, when a person was killed by a car and there were white nationalists rallying, etc., the chiefs of staff of the military services almost universally put out statements saying, we condemn Nazism, we condemn white supremacy, etc. And this was seen in this context as an overtly partisan statement. And those chiefs were criticized by some people and lauded by other people, teams A and B, for sort of taking a side. That's a problem for military people who are trying to maintain order and discipline and cohesion within their ranks. If the public doesn't understand or accept this ethic, it makes it much harder for the military to maintain it. And then again, as I mentioned before, military effectiveness really requires the strategic to be integrated with the operational. These spheres have to overlap. Professionalism has to have some guidance for how military personnel talk about issues that are in fact political and that have political implications. And right now we don't have a professional ethic that does that. Okay, so do we have options? We could double down on Huntington, right? And this is the recommendation of many very intelligent, respectable people, that military officers and NCOs should just become pure technicians. Like, you know, tell me to move the tanks that way, I will move the tanks that way. You know, tell me to destroy all of this country's military targets, I will do so, right? I have absolutely no interest in why I'm doing this. It's basically Sir Humphrey Appleby, right? I have no interest in why the policy is what it is. I don't even care if I think it's good. I don't care if I think it's moral. Just tell me what to do, I will do it. Another possible model that has been put forth, many of you might have seen it as sort of Eliot Cohen's unequal dialogue. Those of you who have read Sam Sarkisian might recognize this as sort of what he recommended. I've been calling it the cooperative model. This is the idea that military officers and NCOs become competent in political ideas and issues and become conscious of the political implications of their behavior, so that they can engage in these strategic planning and operational discussions, and so that they can give good advice to their policymaking superiors, but they should still try to avoid partisanship, that is weighing in on elections, weighing in public on policies. Another model that has been put forward, I would maybe attribute this to Risa Brooks, although she might not agree with that, so don't quote me, is what you might think of as a constitutional model where military officers, NCOs, internalize some ethic based on fundamental constitutional values and adhere to that, even in the face of attempts by politicians to pressure them into things that are inappropriate, for example. This sounds great. We will see on the next slide why it might not be great. And then finally, there's the liberal values model, which again, you might recognize this if you've read any of Jim Burke, who argued that one of the central functions of a military in a democratic society is to maintain the health of the democratic nature of the society, and therefore that the military should internalize an ethic based on upholding liberal and democratic values and adhere to it even in the face of undemocratic and illiberal actions by politicians. So both these last two are sort of making the military the guardians of higher values, right? Asking them to sort of step in when politicians are messing up, right? That is also an appealing position to many people. The idea that, you know, if you get crazy politicians, at least the military will save us. The military will be the adults in the room and they'll make sure that nothing crazy happens, right? Or, you know, if democracy starts to go down the toilet, the military has the character and the stature and the morality to sort of get us back on track. That's kind of what those two models are looking at. There are problems with all of these models, right? I told you there wasn't going to be a nice, clean solution to this. You guys are going to have to help make a decision on which one of these is best. The Huntingtonian model, as Risa Brooks has argued, I think persuasively, provides a facade, but not a reality of an apolitical military. So one of the things she argues is that the Huntingtonian argument or the professional ethic is sort of tautological. And one of the things it does is convince many military people that since they are professionals, which they clearly are, they have technical expertise, they are held to a standard, they have an internal judgment system, etc. Since they're professionals, nothing they do is political. And this tends to allow them to sort of do things that clearly have political implications, but insist that they're doing it for non-political reasons. Like they have the interests of the country at heart, or this is their purely expert technical evaluation, has nothing to do with politics. And, you know, that may be sincere, but in most cases, they somewhere inside recognize that this has political implications and they're not purely neutral advisors. On the other hand, if Huntington's ethic did succeed in providing a purely apolitical military, as we kind of talked about in Doubling Down, then you have the opposite problem of the military not being able to help with strategic planning and strategic effectiveness, and you get a country that can win all of its battles but lose all of its wars. The cooperative model is a really good one. Lots of people like this model. Problem? It's going to have difficulty under extreme polarization, right? Because again, under a cooperative model, you want people to remain non-partisan, and under polarization, everything becomes partisan, right? So it's difficult. It's still better, in my humble opinion, than the Huntingtonian model. The constitutional and liberal values models, I kind of already hinted at what the problem there is that, I mean, number one, again, the constitutional model only works if you actually have consensus in society over what constitutional values are, and we don't. The other problem, though, is that both of these models are putting military officers in a position to judge the constitutionality, the appropriateness, the validity in democratic theory of legitimately elected politicians' behavior, or maybe contestedly legitimately elected politicians' behavior, right? In a country where you have significant disagreement over even what constitutes legitimate power processes or structures, it's going to be really, really problematic to sort of consecrate the military as the defenders of the liberal order. They are not really in a position, in a good position to do that. Okay, so wrapping up, back to the big picture. Healthy and appropriate civil-military relations, which is what we want, are possible, in my view, only in a healthy political community in which the government maintains its own legitimacy. What I mean by that is, if you want good civil-military relations and you want a professional ethic that works, you need a healthy political society. In other words, you can't fix the military in order to fix society. It has to go the other way around, right? The military is not going to fix society. Society needs to fix itself, and then you can work on civil-military problems. Specifically in a democratic republic, a third concern is not just civilian control of the military. Are they obeying orders, or are they sort of insubordinate? It's not just military effectiveness. Can they do the military things we ask them to do? It's also, can they do all this while maintaining the democratic nature, the rule of law nature of the society? And what that requires is that the military not be in a position of policymaker or electoral kingmaker. In other words, that they stay out of politics in some sense. But as we've also seen, they need to do politics in some other senses. So this is a difficult line to draw. But my bottom line, at least from my perspective, is that the military cannot save the republic, and we shouldn't ask it to. The republic has to maintain itself, and this requires popular legitimacy. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope that I've given you all kinds of questions and potential rants to go on.
Thank you, Dr. Khan, for a very intriguing presentation. And I kept putting myself back in uniform and figuring out how I might be, how I might handle situations like this. I mean, and I guess my default is a lot of this polarization, in my mind, I think it would occur at only the senior levels, right? You've got the Secretary of the Navy. Those are civilian politicians effectively in charge of a military uniform force. And then you've got some adult supervision with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the service chiefs that can provide input and have a dialogue and figure out how best to navigate some of this. Because as you get down to the more junior ranks, I think it's kind of you got bits and pieces of certain models that you outlined tonight. But it was but an interesting presentation. I guess at this point I'd like to stop. I would not voice or commandeer your time, but I'd like to get to some of the Q&A. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to open up the floor. I know we got some questions already pending, but as I mentioned before, if you've got a question, please submit it via the Q&A box. I see one or two maybe in the chat box. That's fine. I'll get to those as well. And we'll try to get to as many questions as you have in the time remaining, which is about 10 minutes. So the first question from a colleague, perhaps of yours, as I look back at Anthony Cowden's time at the War College, he writes, I wrote an article which started as a national security affairs leadership paper on the meaning of the oath that members of the armed forces take. But what happens if members of the armed forces have a different understanding of the Constitution? They defend. After all, the January 6th insurrectionists thought they were acting in support of the Constitution. He clarifies a little bit and says many of the insurrections thought that they were acting in support of the Constitution, and a disturbing number of them were veterans or even reservists. Over to you.
Hi, Tony. Yes. No, this is an excellent point. It's exactly what I'm talking about. And what one of the things that I'm saying is a reason that the constitutional values model is a problem for the United States, for example, is that we do not have a consensus on what constitutional values are. We do not have back in, what was it, last January when we had the stand down, the extremism stand down, I was tasked as one of the people to lead one of those seminars. And a lot of the guidance for us was, reinforce the oath. And I was like, the problem is that different members of the military, different members of the public have a completely different understanding of what this oath actually means they should do, exactly as Tony points out. And I should go back and read that article. But that's one of the reasons that I think this model of sort of constitutional values is one that we can't necessarily use. It works in a country like Germany, right? There's a broad consensus in Germany of what constitutes constitutional values. There's very little dissensus there. And what dissensus there is sort of noted by everyone as fringe. And so even with all of the political disagreements that Germans have, they all kind of have a basic consensus on like, what does our constitution mean and what values is it based on? We don't have that, right? And so simply saying to people, remember your oath, is not going to be enough. And George, this kind of brings me back to your point, which is, yes, a lot of what I'm talking about is happening at the highest levels, but I can't tell you how many of my students have talked to me about how difficult they find it to deal with everyday issues within their own units, right? The people that they manage, like, how do I deal with bigotry in my unit? How do I deal with vaccine skepticism in my unit? How do I deal with questions about the constitutional order? You know, and whether, you know, I don't know if anyone remembers, but like back in the 1990s, Specialist Michael New refused to go on a UN peacekeeping operation because he said that the Constitution said that he should never serve under any chain of command other than the American one, so he couldn't serve with the UN. I mean, he was eventually disciplined under the UCMJ, but he was literally raising a constitutional issue. How does Lieutenant so-and-so deal with that, right? I mean, they go to the SJA and they pass it up the chain of command, right? But anyway, I do think that lower level officers and even NCOs are having to deal with these issues as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, terrific. Thank you. From Victor Sussman, does the increasing great power competition presage a reduction in polarization?
So this is actually a really good question. Usually, so one of the things, as I mentioned, is that when there is a consensus on the nature of threat, that helps, right? So when everyone recognized that the Soviet Union was a threat, that helped because everyone could be like, okay, we recognize that this is bad, this is threatening us, and we all recognize that we can't, you know, fix this by sort of, you know, becoming friends. We have to be able to apply coercive power to this. So that consensus is helpful. I don't know that we have that kind of consensus, even with re-emerging great power competition, right? You see significant differences across parties, across ideologies on how to deal with China, for example, whether this is a military threat or something that we need to learn to live with, etc. Russia, even, you do not have broad consensus, right, across parties. If you look at polling, Republicans and Democrats view these threats very differently. So I am not actually very optimistic that even if you see China invade Taiwan, I honestly don't think that the American public is going to be like, oh yes, now we all view China as a specific kind of threat that we agree on. I just don't see it.
No, thank you. So the next question is really just a question about programmatics. I think we intend to record and make this presentation available on our website afterwards. So if you would like to refer to it afterwards, you may. From Victor Sussman again, if commanders have a responsibility to maintain good order and discipline by members, how can they do so more effectively when public reactions to their internal policies may create an appearance of partisanship?
I have no idea. No, no. Again, this is sort of one of the problems that I'm trying to point out is that, and I think I saw in the chat, I'm just seeing little bubbles pop up. You know, the existence of social media has changed a lot in this sense. You have people at all levels of the military talking openly about their experiences, whether they're anonymous or not. They're talking openly about their experiences. They're talking about disciplinary proceedings within the unit. They are expressing views that might be unpopular within the unit. And the availability of this platform is changing the way people feel about its appropriateness, if that makes sense. You know, I think an older generation of military personnel would have looked at social media and thought, I'm not getting on that, that's inappropriate, that needs to be kept to myself, right? But the fact that it's become so pervasive has changed people's feelings about how appropriate it is to share certain things. And so now you have an issue. Now you have an issue with how to deal with these kinds of things as a supervisor, right? As a lieutenant or a captain, or someone at a relatively low unit level, who is trying to figure out, how do I deal with the fact that these people are saying things to each other out in this other space that they are not saying to each other in this space, and they, I need to deal with this dynamic that's happening in multiple different places. I think, I think it would be helpful to restructure the rules for how military personnel can use social media. I think it would be helpful to remind military personnel fairly regularly about what those rules are, but we may have already crossed that bridge. I don't know if you can roll that back. And so if you can't roll it back, what you need is unit leaders who are skilled at handling interpersonal conflict in a context where that conflict may be politicized. And one of my arguments is that right now, the model of professionalism that we have doesn't let them do that. And we need a new one.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And I guess one final from Victor is, why do we have to select one model for ethics? Can we select elements of each akin to Wiley, advocating for cumulative and sequential strategies for operations?
Oh, that is such a great academic answer or question, right? Like, does it have to be one of these? And, of course, you may want to combine elements of these. These are sort of ideal types that I described as choices. But, it's difficult. The real difficulty is drawing the lines, right? The real difficulty is figuring out at what point does the individual's discretion, for example, about liberal values or constitutionality outweigh the obligation to obey lawful orders? At what point does the unit commander's need to maintain good discipline, good order and discipline and cohesion outweigh the individual's, actual legal right to say certain things up to a point? Drawing these lines is the hard part. Picking one of these models is not the difficult part. Drawing the lines is the hard part. And I haven't come across anything yet. I mean, this is the book that I'm working on right now, and I haven't finished it, so I don't have an answer for you. But I haven't seen anything that really provides a good ethical model for how to make that call. And so I think, hopefully we would end up with a professional ethic that has elements of all those things, because constitutionalism is good, liberal values are good, not being too political is good. All of these things are good, right? So we need to figure out how to put together a new model that continues to achieve military effectiveness, both in terms of unit level skills and technical competence, but also in terms of strategic planning, and also maintains the organization's legitimacy in the eyes of the public.
Excellent, thank you. From Michael Desort, of the 4 options, which would you say we're closest to at this time?
You mean empirically? I think the US military believes that it is Huntingtonian. Most military officers in particular, but also, enlisted personnel to a lesser extent, believe themselves to be on the Huntingtonian model. However, that model seems to be eroding into a none of the above, right? It seems to be eroding into we are just like citizens and we have the same rights as citizens and we can say the same things, and I don't see why you can stop me from saying what I want to say or thinking what I want to think. And so I think, what we need is to develop something new to sort of give them a new model that makes more sense in the current context. I don't know if that is a good answer to your question.
Well, thank you, Dr. Khan. We're gonna cut it off there. Quite a few questions. We're gonna try to capture them. I noticed there's a little bit of a glitch with the identity of the person submitting the question. It looks like it's coming up with my Director of Marketing and Communications name, Janine Weisman. So we'll see if we can run that to ground for you. And perhaps Dr. Khan, you'd have the time. Be nice to maybe answer some of the questions via email. That would be terrific for our guests.
I would love to see more of your thoughts. Yes.
It was truly an honor and privilege to host you tonight, Dr. Khan. Certainly to speak about a very interesting topic, and certainly something that generates some interest and feedback from the audience. We appreciate you taking time out of your very busy academic schedule to spend it with us this evening. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, George. I really appreciate the opportunity.
You bet. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's lecture. Our next presentation will be on Wednesday, June 1st, June already, my gosh, June 1st by Professor James Fitzsimons, who will speak about the advanced research program at the college, specifically faculty-led research programs that benefit students, college, and the Navy. Updates to this presentation and others are posted on our webpage at nwcfoundation.org/our-events. Thank you for tuning in tonight and for your continued support for the missions of the Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. The board and staff continue to work hard to generate the resources and margin of excellence required by the college to educate and inform today's decision makers and tomorrow's leaders. Your support and very generous tax-deductible contributions are an investment in their learning and in our national security. So thank you again. As always, we seek to expand our membership and raise awareness of the great institution, which is the U.S. Naval War College. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're already a valued Naval War College Foundation member and know others who might like to learn a little bit more about the Naval War College and Foundation, please consider giving them a gift of membership so that they too can stay abreast of key issues affecting our national security and democratic way of life. You can contact my staff directly for assistance if needed, or simply visit our website and select membership. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again and have a great rest of your evening.